Good evening. So for those who don't know me, my name is Paul Cohen. I have the privilege of serving Temple Jeremiah as a senior rabbi, and on behalf of Rabbi Heaps and Steve Kleiman, the president of our congregation, I just saw him. There he is. Okay. We want to welcome you to Temple Jeremiah. We are so happy to be the host of this program sponsored by Jackpack and to be co-sponsors of this program this evening. And I just wanted to say a word about words. At the beginning of Genesis, God brings things into being with speech, using words. And in fact, one of the lessons that I was taught that the words that a magician uses when they're doing their act, right? And particularly the one act that I always used to see where there's a top hat, a black top hat, and that the magician is wearing and takes off and shows everyone that there's nothing inside the hat, and then takes a wand and waves it over the hat and says the words. Right, abracadabra. Ebara kadabra. I will create with my speech, right? And creating with speech pulls a out of the hat where there was no rabbit before, right? So we know early on that words do indeed have power, not only to convey ideas, to create relationships, to sustain relationships, to cause them to thrive. We know that words can uplift when someone pays us a compliment, says something nice about us. It gives us a little uplift. We also know that the opposite is true, that words have the power to hurt very deeply. And we also know that words lead to actions, again, both for the good and for the bad. We know that this is at the core of our conversation around anti-Semitism, around prejudice, around hatred. We know that words do have power. And so we're going to talk a little bit about words and how they're used and what we can do with our words and with our actions. So we're so pleased to have all of you here, and I'd like to continue by introducing Hollis, who is the executive director of Jackpack, to say a few words about Jackpack and tonight.
I'm not as good as a rabbi, excuse me. I have to use notes tonight, and I hope I could still see him at this hour. Good evening, I'm Hollis Wine. I'm the Executive Director of Joint Action Committee. Thank you, Rabbi Cohn, Temple Jeremiah, for this beautiful event and for letting us come in here, and Nancy Eisenberg and her husband for helping to put this together. And I also want to thank Jack's committee that helped to put this together as well. That's Ashley Wexner, and she worked with a great group of people that came up with this wonderful idea that we needed. We desperately needed to do a program on anti-Semitism. For more than 40 years, Jack has been advocating for issues of importance to the Jewish community. What began as a way to empower women to become involved in the political process surrounding the U.S.-Israel relationship has grown into a national network of women and men. Today, the issues we advocate for have expanded to include reproductive rights, gun violence prevention, the separation of religion and state, and of course, combating anti-Semitism. Through educational programs such as this, we seek to inform and engage people. An educated voter is the best way to protect our values and democracy. Elections have consequences. Everything we care about this election is at stake. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines and let someone else do the work. It's up to each of us to step up and do something. Jack offers you the perfect way to rise up. Become a voter registrar. Write postcards to voters. Reach out to your representative and senators. Let them know what you care about. Have the difficult conversations and let them know you are watching them. You're watching their votes. Here are a couple upcoming events that Jack is hosting. Watch your emails for more information. Jack's Advocacy Committee will hold its first meeting of the year on Tuesday, January 9th, where we will train to become voter registrars. Remember, every vote counts, and everyone is welcome to attend. Our Washington, D.C. Policy Conference is tentatively scheduled for April. This is one of our premier events of the year. There'll be policy briefings from leading experts, special events, and Capitol Hill visits with members of Congress. These are small meetings where you'll have the opportunity to have in-depth discussions with our elected officials. It is an incredibly empowering, life-changing event. Check your inbox again. We'll be sending out more information. It's a cold night here in Chicago, but it's very heartwarming to gather here and on Zoom with so many people who are interested and committed to ending anti-Semitism. Thank you, Oren, for all that you do. You truly embody Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Jack is proud to join you in that effort, and I hope all of you here tonight will join Jack as well. The world certainly needs some more TLC. And with that, Rabbi, I think you're up.
Thank you, Hollis. A few rules of the road. Oren is going to do a presentation. I'm going to introduce him in just a moment. There will be an opportunity to ask questions as well. There are cards that are being handed out and pencils to write the questions down. They will be collated because there might be questions that belong all together. For those who are participating digitally, there's an opportunity to put in the live chat questions, and those will be curated as well to give everyone an opportunity to participate. We know that there are many people participating digitally. There was a little bit of a challenge with the feed. We're working on that right now to make sure that that happens so that you may or may not be able to hear me giving you that instruction. So we will remind everybody once we're certain that everything is going as it is supposed to be going. So I have this wonderful introduction for Oren, and it should just take about an hour and a half, so sit tight. I know, you gave me the short version, and I'm going to edit it a little bit as we go through. Oren Jacobson is a civic entrepreneur, thought leader, and organizer focused on addressing systemic problems. He's the co-founder and executive director of Project Shema, which trains and supports the Jewish community and allies to more effectively address contemporary anti-Semitism, with an emphasis on how anti-Jewish ideas can emerge in progressive spaces, including in discourse around Israel and Palestine. Oren is a nationally recognized expert on this issue, and through this work, he has advised major Jewish institutions and served as a subject matter expert on anti-Semitism to multinational corporations and institutions for higher learning. He's the former National Chapter Development Director for the New Leaders Council, where he helped grow NLC into the largest leadership development organization in the progressive movement. Oren is also the co-founder of Men for Choice, a multi-state advocacy organization focused on bringing men into the fight to protect and expand reproductive freedom. He holds a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, a master's in economics and policy analysis from DePaul University, and a master's in business administration from Regis University. He's an underachiever. He lives in Northbrook with his wife Betsy and their young son Noah Lincoln and their two dogs named after champions of justice, Eleanor Roosevelt and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Oren, welcome back again to Temple Jeremiah.
Good evening. I would ask the, can you hear me okay? No. We on?
Yes, you are. It's going to be adjusted.
Is that better? Everyone's okay? Yeah? All right.
You have to just, yeah.
Is this better? All right. I would ask the dangerous question of how are you, but since October 7th, that question has taken on a very loaded connotation, because inside of our community, inside of many communities, the answer to that question is that we're not okay. And so I want to start this evening off by just giving everybody permission to be however it is that you are entering this space. If you're tired, if you're exhausted, if you're angry, if you're afraid, if you're hopeful and optimistic, I want to talk to you more about what it is that is giving you hope, and hopefully people walk out of here feeling a little bit better in the middle of a very difficult situation for our community. As the rabbi mentioned, my name is Oren Jacobson. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Project Shema, we focus on helping the Jewish community and allies address contemporary anti-Semitism with an emphasis on how anti-Jewish ideas can show up in and around Israel-Palestine discourse in particular. We started working on this in late 2018 because we recognized some of the challenging situations that were unfolding around us. And since October 7th, our organization has worked in more than 30 cities and has done more than 100 different educational programs since that day. My wife is here, and I want to just say thank you for what you've put up with as our team has trained and educated so many times across the country. And this situation has, I think, put a big toll on a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and certainly for my team and for the families that support us. My parents are here as well. I know that toll has not just been borne by us, it's been borne by those who love us. So I want to say thank you for what you've done to support me and to support us in that moment. Here's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to explain a little bit more about our organization, and then the most important piece of what we're going to do is I want to help people understand how and why anti-Jewish ideas move, unnoticed and often unchecked, in conversation around Israel and Palestine. Then, when that's over, I want to offer a roadmap for engagement. It's not enough to diagnose a problem. Our goal is actually to equip you with a pathway forward for conversations with people that you care about, with friends, with allies, maybe allies who have let you down, allies who have been silent, to help them better understand. And then, of course, we'll spend some time in Q&A. My grandfather is one of the few Polish-born Jews to survive World War II. In a room like this, I'm guessing that my story is not going to be totally unique, but he came from a town in Poland called Lublin, which some of you may be familiar with. There was roughly 40,000 Jews in my grandfather's hometown before the war. For context, 40,000 people is about the number of people who can watch the White Sox play baseball in Comiskey. We're not going to call it by the other names. Or in Wrigley. I'm only saying Comiskey because my father's here, and normally nobody knows where the White Sox play baseball, but everybody knows Wrigley Field. 40,000 people is roughly how many people can fit inside of Wrigley or inside of the Cell on the south side of Chicago. So when I think about what it might be like to be in my grandfather's hometown before World War II, I think about what it's like to spend a day watching a ball game on the north or south side of Chicago, and that noise and that vibrancy and that energy, literally surrounded by thousands of members of your community. If you can imagine what it would be like to be inside of that same stadium with fewer than 1,200 people, and how empty it would look, and how quiet and desolate it would feel. My grandfather is one of fewer than 1,200 from his hometown to survive the war. 97 out of every 100 Jews from his hometown lost their life. Now, my grandfather is not a survivor of the Holocaust. He is a survivor of World War II, and there is an important distinction. He survives because at the age of 16, his father saw the warning signs and told him he had to leave. He ended up enlisting in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, fighting in World War II in Africa, and coming back to what we now know as Israel alongside most of the survivors and almost all of the Jews from the broader Middle East who were ethnically cleansed out of their homelands in the aftermath of World War II. That I am here with you today is therefore a literal 3% probability. Now, if any of you are psychologists or therapists, we want to talk afterwards about the fact that I think about my life as a 3% probability. We probably can. I'm not sure that's healthy, but that's how I think about it. And that reality drove me into what we would call social justice activism or progressive organizing. Now I'm 41 and a half years old. Most of my life I felt pretty safe as a Jewish person in America, and that has certainly changed a little bit over the last several years, but because I felt safe and secure and accepted into this society, my energies went towards others. That just as Jews were attacked for the basic crime of being who we were, that I had an obligation to stand up for those who were attacked for the basic crime of being who they are. And I know that so many in our community have also taken that motto to heart. I wear a kippah in public, not just because I'm in the synagogue. And over the last decade, I've organized across the country with progressive activists and organizers that make up a beautiful and diverse coalition. And as a Jewish man who wears a kippah in public, I got asked a lot of questions. Some of them were curiosities. They would ask me about my opinion, let's say, of the current or former government or prime minister, the state of Israel. And sometimes those questions were something else. There was something heated in that question, something judgmental in that question. And over time, that heat became more frequent, and that energy became more problematic. And walking through the world as a Jewish person who cares deeply about progressive movements, and still does, who also has a deep and meaningful relationship to the people, the land, and the state of Israel, has at times had people defining me in ways that I would consider to be incredibly problematic and erasing. And I know that in the aftermath of October 7th, we've all seen that in a very dark way showing up online, on campus, in our schools, and sometimes inside of corporations. And it was because of that we started Project Shema, because we recognized that the community needed more tools and resources to deal with this specific challenge. And as a group of Jewish leaders who are committed to these movements, who are in these places, with these relationships, having these conversations, we came to understand some specific contextual gaps that were enabling anti-Jewish ideas to go unnoticed and unchecked. And that's really what I want to touch on today with you all. Our goal as an organization is to make sure that you all feel prepared, equipped, confident, willing to engage to help slow down the spread of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism isn't going to stop on its own. The only way that it gets better is by Jews and non-Jews engaging in dialogue, in education, and helping people recognize the signs of the problem. And to those of you who are here tonight, either on Zoom or in person, who aren't Jewish, I just want to say thank you to you for being here. We need you more than we ever have before, and I also want to name that in many ways the voices of non-Jews are potentially more important in a moment like this than the voices of Jews, that we need allies to stand up and push back on problematic and harmful ideas. Our goal is to nurture empathy and compassion for our community, but doing that requires giving empathy to others too. That doesn't just mean the people that we're talking to, meaning our friends and peers who may not have a stake in the war. It also means demonstrating genuine empathy for Palestinians and for Muslims who are also experiencing a rise in bigotry in this moment. Right here in our community, a 6-year-old boy lost his life because he was attacked for the crime of being a Palestinian in the aftermath of the Hamas attack on October 7th. And so I know that in moments of war and trauma and fear, that demonstrating empathy for others is incredibly difficult, but it's also incredibly necessary from a moral perspective, from a strategic perspective. And in order to get empathy, we have to be able to give empathy, which is why I chose to go to that young boy's funeral and stand alongside Palestinian friends and neighbors, many of whom I have very little agreement with on many of the key issues, but I would want them there for us and for me if the situation were, God forbid, reversed. Now, I think what most of us recognize, but this graph is designed to make clear, is that whenever there is violence involving Israel, anti-Semitism rises. And I think it's worth noting, although I don't want to sound too hyperbolic in saying this, that the largest attack on Jewish life since the Holocaust has also unleashed the largest spike and surge in anti-Semitism since the Holocaust. And this is part of a pattern that we have seen as violence and conflict has escalated. Now, I want to take us back to October 7th and October 8th, because in the immediate aftermath of the attack, we did really see widespread outpouring of love and sympathy and empathy and support, and this last image in particular to me is incredibly striking. To see the Israeli flag broadcast like this in the middle of Berlin is no small thing. And it's also worth recognizing in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack that many of our national progressive elected officials immediately condemned what has happened. And yet, especially today, I know that it doesn't feel like that. That today, the combination of the silence of friends, those who may have condoned or justified the attack by Hamas, the way in which the rhetoric around the war itself has evolved, the language being used around the war, many Jews being defined as genocide supporters because some of us have friends whose family members are still held hostage, that language is incredibly dehumanizing and is causing more anti-Jewish attacks to occur. Now, one of the things that comes up everywhere we go to talk, especially from people who identify as part of the progressive movement or are liberal, is how is it that a movement that talks about inclusion and is focused on combating bigotry could engage in ways that are exclusive and or potentially even push forward bigotry? And I want to help answer that question for everybody today, because that question is actually the key to any solution moving forward. There are 4 key problems to understand. The first is that most people don't actually know what it means to be a Jew. Now, in the tip of the iceberg, the way that most people, especially in America, understand Jewish identity is through the idea that Jews are simply a white religious community. We are effectively like Catholics or Protestants or evangelicals. We just pray on the wrong day, and we don't accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior. But that is actually not an accurate way to understand Jewish identity. And if I say anything wrong, Rabbi, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me. Thank you. Right? That the idea of a religion as part of our identity is one piece of the pie. It is not the entire pie. Right? The Jews have identified as a people or a nation for literally thousands of years longer than what we've come to understand as a modern organized religion. Right? Am Yisrael, the people or nation of Israel. Jews aren't simply a religious group. We are much more like an ethnic group than we are purely a religious community. And Jews have had a cultural, historical, linguistic connection to each other for thousands and thousands of years. Even the word Jew or Jewish does not derive from the word Judaism. In fact, the word Judaism derives from the word Jew and Jewish, which derives from the land itself, where the Jewish people are from. In the context of skin color, it's really critical to recognize that, yes, most Jews in the United States, and in particular in the Western world, have access to whiteness, are identified as white, are racialized as white. Although it's really important to recognize that in some countries and in some eras, even Jews who had my skin color wouldn't be considered white. And there are people in this country who do not accept Jews as white and rather argue that Jews are undermining the white race in this country. If we go outside of the United States, right, and inside of the state of Israel, the majority of Jews inside of the state of Israel would be defined by our racial frameworks as Jews of color, although needless to say, not everybody on earth uses America or the West's racial identity construct to define themselves. So the first big challenge is that people don't actually know who or what we are. Now, that makes it really difficult to understand what anti-Semitism is. Because if you believe that anti-Semitism is, or if you believe that Jews are just a religious community, then you will believe that anti-Semitism is just religious bigotry, when in fact anti-Semitism has morphed over the centuries, and contemporary anti-Semitism is much more racialized. I'm not saying the same as racism, but it's much more racialized in its contemporary form. Anti-Semitism is really about people. It is usually manifesting as anti-Jew or Jew hatred and not as anti-Judaism. We are typically not attacked for how we pray. Rather, we are attacked for what we do, or rather what people accuse us of doing to undermine society. Take the example of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh in 2018. The shooter didn't go to the synagogue that morning because he was upset about the Torah portion. He went to the synagogue because he believed that the Jews were undermining the white race by resettling brown migrants from Central and Latin America. The synagogue was not a religious institution in his mind, but a physical container to find and attack Jews who he was blaming for undermining the white race. Even the word anti-Semitism itself is racialized language. It was coined by the Germans as part of their pseudo-racial science to prove that the white Aryan race was the dominant race on earth and all other races were, in fact, inferior. Now, they have a small problem. The small problem is that there are Jews walking around their country who look like me, and I have white skin. So what do? They essentially define Jews who were not allowed to be German or white because we were a nefarious outsider who couldn't be trusted. They define Jews as part of the Semitic races, and hence the language of anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism is even coined in a racialized way. Now, why does this matter so much in the context of discourse around Israel and Palestine in particular? If Jews are just a religious community, then anti-Semitism is just religious bigotry, and criticism of Israel is only anti-Semitic if I criticize Judaism. The reality is that the word Judaism almost never comes into the conversation around Israel except as follows, quote, "I have no problem with Judaism, comma, but." Which means most of your non-Jewish friends, to say nothing, by the way, of some of our Jewish friends, are actually looking for the wrong thing, are looking for the wrong words, the wrong language, the wrong ideas to identify anti-Semitism when it's present. And if you're looking for the wrong thing, you're not going to see it when it's in front of you. And if Jews are just a religious community, then we are not a people or a nation, and therefore we are not entitled to national self-determination in a world organized under nation states, and therefore anti-Zionism can never be anti-Semitic because it isn't an objection to our religion, but rather a political movement by a group of people who share a similar religion. Now, most people don't really know what Zionism is, how Jews understand it. Most people don't even know what the word Zion means. Right? Zion means Jerusalem. And while the political movement of Zionism is roughly 125 years old, meaning the movement for a nation state in a world of nation states, the idea of Zionism, the longing of the Jewish people to return to our ancestral homeland, is millennia old. It is a part of our entire story. In fact, and again, Rabbi, you can correct me if I'm wrong, a large reason why the organized religion of Judaism even begins to form is because of Jewish leaders who, in exile, work to write down and codify our histories and our stories and hold on to who it is that we are when we are separated from the land, right? The holiday of Sukkot, it doesn't mark the seasons of Chicago. It's tied to the seasons of Zion. So there is no way to separate the Jewish people from this land. There is no way to simply say to be Jewish is just to practice a religion, because that religion is rooted in this land. Which brings us to the third particular challenge. Now, inside of the progressive movement, the way that we think about systemic oppression and systemic power, there's a visual on screen, and I want you to look at the purple first. Right, on the outside of the purple are sort of the dominant identity structures in our society. In the inside circle, the green circle, are the marginalized identity structures in our society. And in the way the progressive movement thinks about power and oppression and bigotry, we think about dominant groups consuming most of the resources and applying a lot of pressure on those on the inner circle to conform to the norms and narratives and structures of the world. Now, I think what is obvious for us in the United States is that the Jewish community, especially in the last 50 or 60 years, has had a diasporic experience that is truly unique for us, meaning Jews have become largely accepted into the broader society and have access to resources and have been largely successful in a way that most other marginalized groups, minority groups, have not been. Now, I want to think about this challenge in a more linear framework because this is a little bit easier. In the way that we think about systems and power in the progressive movement, we think that the groups that are on top in a society, those who are part of dominant cultures, never end up on the bottom of a society. You never end up systemically attacked in a society once you're in the dominant group. And it makes sense if you think about the story of the United States, right? And the story of race in the United States in particular. And so it's really difficult to imagine how a group that is associated as part of the dominant group in a society could end up marginalized or oppressed. And in the story, Jews are understood as a white religious community, therefore we are part of the dominant group, therefore we are safe, therefore we are secure, and therefore anti-Semitism cannot be urgent, nor can anti-Semitism be systemic, because systemic bigotries don't allow marginalized groups to rise into the dominant society. However, anti-Semitism just works differently. Now, keep in mind, these graphs are not to scale. They're just here to tell a story. But as anti-Semitism surges from the fringes of a society into the mainstream, historically, the status and safety of Jews can and has changed rapidly. The most obvious example of this is the example from Germany. And if we go back to the 1920s, you might define some members of the Jewish community as privileged in Germany in the early 1920s, right? There were Jews in positions of power and influence in the arts, in culture, in business, and yes, even inside the German government at the start of the 1920s, and we all know what happened over the next 20 years over the entire continent. The challenge is that most people think of the Holocaust as a one-off aberration, when in fact the Holocaust is just the worst example of a continuous pattern of life in Jewish history. It's the worst example of a continuous pattern. And that is true regardless of where we have lived, or what our skin color has been, or what our economic status has been inside of those societies. I could take you not just to Germany, but to France, to the Soviet Russia, to Ukraine, or to Ethiopia, to Egypt, to Iraq, to Iran, to Yemen, to Syria, to Lebanon. And you could find a period in time in which Jews were living safely, potentially even thriving, only for something in that society to change. And it didn't matter if we had the right skin color, it didn't matter if we had the right political status, it didn't matter if we had economic power, it didn't matter how long we had lived there, and it didn't matter what we had contributed to that society. Something changed, and Jewish status and safety also changed rapidly. But because people don't understand who Jews are, and they don't understand what anti-Semitism is, and they don't know what they're looking for, and they don't understand how anti-Semitism works, our voices can feel very hyperbolic when we talk about the rise in anti-Semitism, because they look at our community and they see a strong, thriving community here, and if we're being honest with ourselves, the Israelis have much more systemic power than the Palestinians do in this conflict. And so it's easier to dismiss our concerns when you don't understand our identity or what anti-Semitism is or how anti-Semitism works. Now, this is true across the society, regardless of people's political orientation, but there's one additional dynamic that is unique to the modern, contemporary, progressive movement that is really important and now is probably far more familiar to you all than maybe it had been on October 6th. As progressives, we think about the world through the lens of systems, systemic power. We've heard the language of systemic racism more and more since George Floyd's murder. And in particular, these two pillars that we talk about a lot in the progressive world of white supremacy and colonialism as upholding these modern systems of power. And perhaps these ideas are a really helpful way to understand the history of the United States. But they're a terrible way to understand non-Western conflicts and non-Western histories. Now, it's really important to think about this like a lens, meaning it's the lens through which people are filtering information and processing how the world works. So they're looking at our community, or they're looking at the conflict, and they're seeing the world through the lens of, and they're interpreting the events of the conflict and the war through the lens of systems of power and oppression. And for some, but not all, for some, this lens can be applied in an absolute way. And whenever you have an absolute framework, it leads to binary thinking. And binary thinking erases space for alternative explanations and for empathy. And that is essentially what is happening right now, is that some people are looking at this through the lens of a hard binary, which defines things simply into an oppressor or oppressed framework, the colonialists or the indigenous. So in this moment, you have this binary, and you have the contextual gaps that I've mentioned, right? That people don't know what it means to be Jewish, they don't know how anti-Semitism works, they don't know what it is, and you have biases. And all of that is leading to people arriving at problematic conclusions and people not even noticing problematic rhetoric when it's present. I want to touch for a moment on biases. Inside of our movement, we talk often about the need to unpack our biases, to think about the ways that we are educated and socialized, recognizing that we're fed information that's problematic from the time that we are young, and unless we pause to question why we think about things a certain way, we will continue on with our biases. Now, has anyone ever noticed that literally every cartoon villain has a hooked nose? Every cartoon villain in every Disney movie has a hooked nose. Hooked nose. There's a reason why the idea of being evil is associated with a hooked nose. And it's because for millennia, Jews have been defined as evil, and one of the physical characteristics of Jews has been our nose. But most people have never paused to think about the fact that the way in which cartoons depict the idea of who is evil is tied to anti-Semitic ideas. And the reality is that while many of us have unpacked or spent time thinking about how racism impacts us, or sexism, or misogyny, most people have never spent any time learning about anti-Semitism or even exploring whether or not they have biases when it comes to the question of Israel and Palestine, because they've never spent time unpacking anti-Semitism. And so essentially these binary frameworks shrink or eliminate our capacity to empathize with Jews or with Israelis because we don't fit neatly into this story, into this framework, into this narrative, which is allowing people to wrap problematic ideas in the language of justice and have it go unnoticed and unchecked in progressive spaces. And that's effectively what is happening around us right now, that people don't know who Jews are, what anti-Semitism is, how it works, and because of these contextual gaps and the lens through which people are trying to understand the world, rhetoric that you and I might identify as problematic, saying Zionists are racists, describing Jews as genocide supporters if you refuse to call for a ceasefire today, that language like that can be normalized and tolerated in a space which inevitably will lead to anti-Jewish sentiment spreading. You can't say that 9 in 10 people in a group are racist because they believe the state of Israel has the right to exist and the right to defend itself, and not expect biases and bigotries about that group to perpetuate. Most of our peers don't notice the rhetoric. The problem is not that all progressives hate Jews. In fact, most of the people I've spent time around, and I've spent time around thousands of progressive leaders across this country do not want to harm Jews. And many of them have stood with us in the aftermath of anti-Semitic violence when they saw it and understood it clearly. But most of them don't see the problem and can't see the rhetoric when it's there because it's not connected to the things they're expecting. It's not about Judaism, it's about Jews, and it's often coded language that is defining Jews in harmful ways. In our work, what we believe and what we're trying to do is to create space for empathy for Jews and Israelis alongside Palestinians. You're not going to be effective trying to convince somebody to choose. And people who are forcing others to choose are engaging in ways that are neither progressive nor humanistic and is a problematic approach. So with that, diagnosis is done. You don't have to accept the diagnosis. We can debate the diagnosis afterwards. But if you accept the diagnosis, I want to offer you a path forward. Now, the good news for everybody is everything that I just said and what I'm about to share with you is going to be sent to you in resources that our organization has put together since October 7th so that you can leverage these ideas, including conversation guides and guides that you can give allies. So everything that we're going through tonight, we're actually going to be providing for you. Our main concern is that our non-Jewish friends don't know what to push back on because they can't identify the problems. So we have to help them identify the problems to help them push back on those problems. Specifically, I want to talk about, at a high level, 3 types of harm we're seeing. The harm of erasure and exclusion, right? The exclusion of Jews from spaces because of our relationships to the state of Israel, or the erasure of Jewish identity, Jewish history, Jewish trauma. The harm of demonization, right? Demonizing Israel, Zionism, and Jews as inherently evil, and the harm of dehumanization, which most of us would think about as the contemporary forms of the ancient tropes that we're used to. But it's these 2 things in particular that are most common, that language which demonizes Israel as an inherently evil phenomenon, often to legitimize the destruction of or the delegitimization of the existence of the state, or language which demonizes or dehumanizes Jews who have a relationship to the state. So I've used this example before, but I'll use it again. I have a friend who still has family members who are held hostage. I understand why my friend thinks that there shouldn't be a ceasefire until the hostages are released. I recognize how difficult that is and the pain and suffering of everybody in Gaza because of the ongoing of the war, and I also recognize that for my friend, it is a perfectly human, understandable, logical position to take. But he is constantly called a genocide supporter, in spite of the fact that his family is still being held hostage by Hamas. That's what I mean when I'm talking about demonizing and dehumanizing Jews for our relationship to Israel. As we do this work, we cannot demonize Palestinians or those who support the Palestinian community. Our job, rather, is to make sure problematic language doesn't become more mainstreamed in the society. Now, most of us want to debate the wrong people. What do I mean by that? We want to convince the people who are not convincible that they're wrong, rather than engaging the people who may be willing to hear us. So, do not invest your time and energy talking to people who celebrated or condone what happened. Do not invest your energy engaging with people who are normalizing violence against Jews. And the moment you realize that a person you're talking to cannot offer empathy to you individually or to the Jewish people collectively, there is no value right now in continuing that conversation. Instead, we should be engaging people we have relationships with, who are reaching out for advice, who have offered support, even if just privately, who have demonstrated empathy with our community, even if imperfectly, who have demonstrated empathy with Palestinians in ways that you think are potentially harmful to our community. And again, these are people you have relationships with, and therefore you have a reason to believe that they care about you and they care about our community, and those who have been silent. Now, I know those who have been silent have also been those who have probably been most hurtful to us on a personal level. So I just want to say one thing about those who have been silent. In many cases, they're silent because they don't know what to say. They may have Jewish friends and Palestinian friends or Muslim friends, and they are watching how everybody is getting yelled at on social media. Everybody's getting attacked no matter what they say. And what they're saying is, I don't want to hurt anybody, so I'm not going to say anything. They need our help to find the words to say. And if we engage them, even now, their words can be impactful. Now, many of you, I think, have probably noticed or spoken out about the fact that so many women's rights organizations were silent about the rape, mutilation. 2 weeks, we've seen organizations who were silent since October 7th finally speak up and condemn what happened on October 7th. And while, yes, from my perspective, it's 8 weeks too late, or it's 8 weeks later than it should have been, it's important now that people are still being willing to talk about this. And so for those who've been silent, engage them. I'm not going to go in depth through these messages. They're all in the resources you're going to get. The one thing that I want to remind people here is that to the extent that this is just a concern for the Jewish people, it is harder to bring people with us. What I mean by that is we need to help everybody understand what is at stake for them in the spread of anti-Semitism. That the spread of anti-Semitism erodes the health of a society. That it undermines democracy. Democracy is necessary for the protection of civil rights. And without civil rights, all marginalized groups are harmed or at risk. And moreover, it is incredibly dangerous to normalize the idea that political violence is an acceptable means to solve a problem. We live in a society that has experienced an act of domestic terror in the last few years. And we do not want to be normalizing the idea that targeting innocent civilians to solve political conflict is acceptable in our society. But unfortunately, there are many people who have defined what happened on October 7th as just or even justified or necessary. I'm going to finish with this, and then we'll go to question and answer. On the screen, you see something we call the engagement funnel. This is the roadmap for your conversation. Now, what you'll notice at the very bottom is a section that says addressing hard questions. It might not surprise you that almost every conversation our community has about Israel starts at the very bottom of this funnel. Somebody says something we don't like, and we immediately say, no, you're wrong, or no, you're an anti-Semite. If you accept what I have argued tonight as a diagnosis of the problem, there is literally nothing you could say starting at the bottom of the funnel that would effectively deal with the spread of anti-Semitism. There is no talking point I can give you. Even if you could memorize it and deliver it perfectly, that would work, because there is a major contextual gap between you and the person you're talking to. That in order to actually help somebody understand our concerns and shift their perception or the way that they're communicating, you actually have to work through the funnel from the bottom or from the top to the bottom. You have to have a relationship. You have to build trust interpersonally. You have to demonstrate empathy. You have to explain who and what Jews are. You have to explain what anti-Semitism and how it works. And the best part about this is you don't need to be an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You don't need to be an anti-Semitism expert. You just need to be able to speak honestly about your own fears and our history, which all of us have the ability to do. The one final note I'll say is to go back to your starting point about words. So much of the problem we're having is about language and the limitation of language and the assumption that we understand what somebody means with what they say. For example, some people are saying Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. But when pressed on which river and which sea, they don't know. Is that person calling for the destruction of the state of Israel? Maybe accidentally, but if they don't know the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea and what that means for the actual border of the state of Israel, then I would argue that they don't actually know what they're saying, and they may not actually be saying something that they mean to say. Some people might use the word occupation, and they might mean the occupation circa 1967 in the West Bank. Other people might mean the occupation starting in 1948 with the formation of the State of Israel. And those two conversations are very different conversations. So it's incredibly important that as you have this dialogue, you don't react to the words that people are saying, but rather you seek clarity on what they mean with the language that they're using. In the aftermath of the May 2021 war, a friend of mine, who is a very far-left friend, who had been to Israel, by the way, on a trip that I had set up, and had gone into a shelter from Hamas rockets in 2018, called me up and said, "Hey, Oren, are you a Zionist?" And, I'm going to leave her name out of this to spare her. And I said, "Why are you asking if I'm a Zionist?" And she said, "Well, I'm seeing all this stuff on social media that says Zionists are racists, and Zionism is racism and imperialism and colonialism and all these things, and I know you. And so, that doesn't sound very good. Are you that?" And I had a little bit of a chuckle like you just had. And I walked her through a little bit of our process and our funnel. And I said, "You told me that you think Israel has a right to exist." She's like, "Yeah, of course. I support a two-state solution. I oppose BDS. That's what I believe." And I said, "I've got bad news for you. You're a Zionist." And so my point being that our words really matter, but most of us don't actually have shared definition on that language, which is why it's so important that people who have relationships, whether it's inside of a corporation, on a college campus, inside of a classroom, or in civic organizations, pause and have a conversation about what that language means and try to engage differently, because many, if not most people in the progressive movement are actually reachable on the question of slowing down the spread of anti-Semitism if we know how to engage them effectively. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and we'll turn to Q&A.
Thank you so much. As you were, particularly on this last point, you and I have been talking about movie references, and I couldn't help but think of the Princess Bride, and where Vicini continues to use the word inconceivable. And Fezzik says, "I do not think that word means what you think it means," right? That he kept using it all the time and in a way that seemed wildly inappropriate. And I think that what you've touched on is that that's often the case, that people are using words and phrases and not understanding that what they are actually saying can have a very hurtful and very dangerous meaning as well. And so I'd like to give you an opportunity to expand a little bit more about, because it's not just with October 7th, the events, but why has anti-Semitism seem to become so mainstream, and where people feel like they can, just blatantly flaunt this ideology, this hatred at this time?
Ooh, that's an easy one. So, I've spent tonight talking about how anti-Jewish ideas can present in the progressive movement, and in case it's news to anybody else, there are other movements in this country, and there's anti-Semitism in those movements too. And I think one of the things that is true, historically speaking, is that when you have leaders from the highest orders of our society who normalize the idea that you can demonize, humiliate, target those who you define as other, you give permission to the society for the society to work or to engage in its worst impulses. That's, I think, one element of this. And I don't think there's any question that we have had leaders at the highest level of our country who have normalized the idea that not just targeting the other, and targeting the other is bad enough on its own, but also normalizing the idea that it's okay to define those who have a different worldview or perspective than you as themselves evil. That's one element. I think the second thing historically is that anti-Semitism thrives in unhealthy systems in that society. So historically, right, when there's been plagues, Jews have gotten blamed, like the literal plague was blamed on Jews. War, economic hardship, famine, etc. Jews have all been blamed for all of those things. And if you think about the last 20 plus years in this country, you've had war, you've had economic hardship. We haven't had a famine that I'm aware of, but we have had a plague. And so you have all of these dynamic problems that people often look for easy explanations for. And because anti-Semitism is rooted in conspiracy theories which blame the Jews for these problems, oftentimes those stories spread and become easy to latch onto. So if you think about, and this is, I'm going to bring something from the far right into this conversation and the far left together. For those of you who have ever spent time on a far right blog or website, which you don't have to do, it's not that entertaining, unless you do what I do, it's somewhat entertaining, I guess. There's a theory that's called ZOG, ZOG. And what it stands for is the Zionist Occupied Government. And it's a far-right idea that the Zionists are actually in control of the governments. Not just this government, the governments. And so that language is normalized in the far right, that there's this conspiracy that the Jews are in control of the government. And that even in this moment, you have a different brand of anti-Zionism on the far right, which sees this war as a direct byproduct of the Zionist control of the United States government, driving us into another war in the Middle East. And at the same time, there are others in the far left who see Zionism as one of the key isms that is responsible for upholding pillars of oppression. That you can't have climate justice without dealing with the problem of Zionism. So it's rooting Zionism and the existence of the State of Israel as part of the explanatory factors that are causing the problems of the world. That what is holding, what is preventing the liberation of the Palestinian people is the presence of the United States or Western powers' support of the State of Israel. And if only the US and the UK and the EU no longer supported Israel, the whole thing would get solved, right? And that's a different angle at a similar argument that is rooted in a conspiracy. It's rooted in a conspiracy to explain something, to offer a simple explanation for something which is incredibly complex.
So in this, expand a little bit more on how we can help those who aren't Jewish, help them to understand the threat of anti-Semitism and how it's not just a Jewish problem. It's not just a Jewish issue.
There has never been a movement or a society where anti-Semitism flourished and that movement or society was vibrant. Literally every society where anti-Semitism flourishes, the society decays. Because anti-Semitism is rooted in conspiracies, and a better word for conspiracies are lies, anti-Semitism being mainstreamed literally destroys truth. It destroys shared fact and shared truth. And when a society no longer knows what is true and what is not, and who they can trust, that society is effectively doomed. It's effectively doomed. And that's part of the reason why, historically, political actors who are seeking power have weaponized anti-Semitism for their own power, because it's a useful tool for power. And so, in the case of the United States in particular, because democracy requires shared fact and shared truth, or at least some basic agreement of what is real and what is not real, the spread of anti-Semitism erodes the most important and necessary element for a democratic society, which is some agreement on what is real and what is not real. In the absence of that agreement, everything is propaganda, no one can be trusted, and every story is believable. There's never been, I shouldn't say never, but I don't know, and my dad's a history teacher, so I apologize if I should know this, Dad, but I'm not aware of how many benevolent dictators have ever existed. It doesn't seem to me that benevolent dictators are all too common. They're certainly not too common in this world. And it's worth noting that most of the citizens of the world live inside of dictatorships that are oppressive. Democracy is necessary to protecting civil rights for people who are not identified as the right group by the leader or the party that is defining who is part of the nation. Without naming names, there's at least some political actors in our country who define some folks as a threat to real America, right? They're not part of us, they're them. And so when truth is destroyed and shared fact are destroyed because lies are mainstreamed, what is necessary to uphold democracy goes away, which means you lose what is necessary to protect civil rights, which means anybody who is defined as part of the them, which in this country is almost certainly going to be black, brown, queer, Muslim, Jewish, all of our collective safety becomes at risk, not just the safety of the Jewish community as anti-Semitism spreads.
How do we do a better job of helping people understand that? Right? I mean, that's at the crux of this, is that it doesn't seem, because it seems like when people start to talk about colonialism and the intersectionality and in these progressive spaces, and not understanding that they're actually undermining the work that they're trying to do to promote the welfare of their particular community.
So it's a great question, because there's an argument being put forward by some, and I sort of alluded to this, that you can't have climate justice without having Palestinian justice, that you can't have reproductive justice without having Palestinian justice, that somehow we can't expand abortion rights and access in this country until Palestine is free from the river to the sea. I would argue that that's both rhetorically wrong, intellectually wrong, politically and strategically unwise, even as I want to name that I believe the Palestinian people deserve the same exact rights and ability to pursue their own individual and national aspirations as the Israeli people do, and they are unable to do so for factors that are more complex than simply the word colonialism. What I don't think that our progressive friends understand is, and not those who are using that language, it's those who may not be using that language and may not be pushing back on that language, is that when you start to define Israel as simply being understandable as a colonial enterprise, that's the only way to understand this, that it is essentially defining that state and all who support it as supporting a white supremacist colonial enterprise. That the outcome, not the intent, the impact of that language is to define almost every Jewish person on earth as complicit in the greatest sins of the Western world. And you can't define almost everybody out of a community and not expect anti-Jewish harm to follow. Part of what is so complicated in this conversation holistically is that because it involves Israel, we often default into what I would define as Israel advocacy, which is the feeling that I have to endlessly defend the state of Israel, even for things that I disagree with, which, by the way, is leading a lot of our young people to sort of walk away from the conversation altogether. We don't talk about this through the lens of Israel advocacy. What we talk about this through the lens of is individual and collective harm to Jews, and recognizing the ways in which that language can undermine the individual or collective safety of the Jewish people here and globally. Because if you endlessly define Israel as a colonial state, and that's the only way that you want to explore it, and then you also define it as a genocidal actor, which means it's uniquely evil, then you might argue that solving that problem should occur by any means necessary, which necessarily would risk the lives of at least 7 million Jews in the state of Israel, to say nothing of the ways in which it defines Jews in the United States, most of whom are, Zionist or believe Israel should have the right to exist, whatever language that we use, by defining us as people who are complicit in colonialism, which enables the demonization and dehumanization of Jews here. And by the way, I should also add, is being really effectively weaponized politically by the movement's opponents right now. It's probably going to be the number one wedge issue being leveraged by the opponents of the progressive movement over the next 12 months because it's the most divisive issue amongst the progressive movement.
Do you think there's any awareness of that in the progressive movement? Are you finding that in the spaces in which you move, that there's an awareness that there's a great danger?
Yes and no. Most people in the movement are really, to the extent that they're focused on this, which is not everybody, are really thinking about how do you end the war? Mm-hmm. And then once the war is over, how do you change the reality so that there isn't another war and there can be peace and justice and, I think the things all of us want. Some people, I think, begrudgingly recognize the issue but also feel powerless to stop it. Mm-hmm. But I don't think people have fully reckoned with the fact that I don't think people are thinking about this through the lens of political strategy, at least not right now.
Yeah. Let's talk about social media for a moment. And is there a way to successfully address anti-Semitism on social media in 5 words or less?
No. So the social media challenge is interesting because I'm a big believer in not ceding the space anywhere. So there's a big debate inside of our community right now about diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, right? Some people are saying DEI programming needs to go away. What our organization says is as long as that programming exists, we need accurate education around anti-Semitism and Jewish identity inside of those spaces until somebody else changes that structure. So I don't think you can stop trying to deal with the problem on social media, but you have a volume issue, right? There's roughly 15 to 16 million Jews. Even if all of us had like the perfect talking point and the best reel and the perfect post and like the best video, there's like 8 billion other humans, not to mention how many bots are out there posting content all the time that are going to flood the zone, so to speak. And so it's really hard for our ideas, our narrative, to really travel in the same way. And the reality is that I can demonize Israel really quickly. Israel is a settler, colonial, apartheid, genocidal regime. Did I miss any of the buzzwords? It's a lot harder to deconstruct that framework. So here's the way that we teach on social media. Number one, there is value to you pushing back on social media because it gives strength to your friends who are afraid to speak up on social media. And for good reason, a lot of us are afraid to speak up on social media because you say anything and you get yelled at. That's about all the things, but on this thing in particular, that's true. Number two, you should think of social media as a one-way communications device. It is not a listening device. It's not a listening device, meaning it's almost a total waste of time to read what is being said back to you. So what that means is you should go there to communicate the message you want to communicate, but you shouldn't be reading everything that comes back to you, because what comes back to you is both going to be unrepresentative and it's probably not going to make you feel all that good on this particular issue. I joke that Joe Biden is the president of the United States because he's not on Twitter. And I joke, but it's also a serious theory in my head, because if you go back to the 2020 presidential campaign, most of the Democratic primary candidates were chasing Twitter activists. And whatever the Democratic or progressive activists were saying on Twitter that day was like the thing that the candidates talked about on the stump the next day. And you ended up in a situation where they were talking to maybe 10% of the electorate. And because Joe Biden was never on Twitter, and he knows everybody everywhere, real humans in real places, he would go to somebody like you and say, tell me about your community, where are they, how are they feeling, what are they thinking about, and that's how he would communicate with people. And so I think it's really important to recognize that online is real, but it's also not the real world, and that if you use it as a communications device, it's one way. And the final thing that I would say is, with people that you know, move them from online to offline. Do not get in debates with them in your Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. If you say something on social media and they respond back in a way that you're not in love with, don't debate them on the feed. Reach out to them and have a conversation. The odds that you can have a good conversation about this in that platform are almost non-existent. Possible, but almost non-existent. The conversations that I've had offline, including, by the way, with people who have organized alongside BLM in Chicago, have been totally different than what we would expect based on what's happening online.
Thank you. So let's take it back into the real world. Are there things that can be done on a state level to fight anti-Semitism? So we've been talking a lot about individuals and having conversations, and talk a little bit about that.
Policy-wise?
Yeah.
So our focus as an organization is not really on, we don't have a policy agenda or a political agenda, we're just an education organization. I always worry with the idea of passing laws designed to deal with something like this, because this is rhetoric in most cases. It can turn to violence. And I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't want anybody determining what speech is okay. In fact, you might make an argument that part of what's happened on college campuses is that some universities went down the path of moderating some kinds of speech, and then when that speech became harmful for Jews, they didn't know what to do. They kind of built a trap for themselves, as opposed to saying, we're going to be free speech absolutists, and obviously the First Amendment has boundaries. You can't incite violence and have free speech protection. So I think about that. What can be done at a policy level? I want to get actually more micro than the state. If you work inside of a corporation, your corporation can, and your corporation does DEI programming, your company should provide regular anti-Semitism education to the members of the team in line with whatever other isms they educate about. So if they're doing education on anti-black racism or Islamophobia or anti-LGBTQ bigotry, anti-Semitism should be part of that. If there are employee resource groups inside of your corporation, there should be a Jewish employee resource group as well. I think at the school level and the K-12 level in particular, the schools have an obligation to put the needs and interests of students first, which means the school environment and the classroom must feel safe and welcoming for all students, which also inherently means that educators need to have some training and equipment both about anti-Semitism and some conversations about what it is that those individuals are posting on social media in their own personal life. Meaning, I've heard way too many stories about 11th grade social studies teachers who are posting publicly on social media all the time about the conflict and then coming into the classroom and having to deal with Jewish students. How is it that a Jewish student is supposed to feel safe in that environment if you're a teacher talking about genocide or whatever the case might be? And maybe you're an adult who believes it's genocide, and I'm not going to argue with you on that point. You can read the language and decide that it is or it isn't. It's just to say your students should come first, and that has to be a conversation inside of the school district. On the college campus level, I don't think the universities should shut down people from speaking as long as they're not violating the First Amendment principles around incitement to violence. So that's one thing. That said, many universities require permits to protest. You can't just go onto the quad and host a protest. You actually have to get a permit and all this stuff. The university does not have to grant a permit if the protest is going to be outside of a Jewish institution, or if the march is going to go by Hillel, or Chabad, or the kosher diner. And the university should define the targeting of Jews or Jewish institutions for protest as an act of anti-Semitism, because it is inherently anti-Semitic to target Jews or Jewish institutions for the actions of other Jews, including the actions of the Jewish state. So they can deny that protest. If people show up anyways, you can revoke those people's right to host more protests, or you can provide additional security around the environment and or continue to condemn those actions when they happen. In some ways, I think the challenge at universities is not that young people shouldn't be young people. I think about what I thought at 19, 20, 21, and for that matter, most of my 20s and into some of my 30s, and I was a moron. The adults need to be adults. I'm not asking the 20-year-old to be the most mature, well-read human being at 20. But it is reasonable to expect the adults are going to be adults. And I think in many cases the adults aren't always being adults in this case in terms of what they allow to be normalized on those campuses.
There was a question asking you to share a little bit more about your experience at the funeral for that 6-year-old Muslim boy.
So, I don't even remember when it was, but it couldn't have been more than a week or two after October 7th, right? I mean, it was in the first 2 weeks. I got a call from a Palestinian friend of mine, said that the funeral is at this time. Would you come? And I said, yes, of course, I'll come. I couldn't travel with her. And so I got there by myself. I parked somewhere and I start walking up, and there's Palestinian flags everywhere. And I'm walking, I've got my kippah on, and a gentleman sees me. And the first thing he says to me when he sees that I'm Jewish is, "Don't worry, you'll be safe. You'll be safe." Which was both comforting and also a little shaking at the same time, because I wasn't walking in thinking I'm going to go to a funeral and be, at risk. But it was interesting to me that he saw a Jewish man who he didn't know coming to a mosque for a funeral of a Palestinian boy, and his first inclination was, "I want you to know that you'll be safe here." Beyond that, the mosque was already full by the time I got there, but it was somebody had let the security team know that I was coming, and they wanted me to be inside. So they took me inside, and, you know, I watched for an hour as thousands prayed. And it was, you know, then I watched the coffin being taken out to get into the car. You know, you could see it wasn't just grief. It was a combination of grief and anger and rage from different people in different ways. And I saw there's one Palestinian man who's a state rep here. His name is Abdel Nasser Rashid. And Naz and I have known each other for a while. We don't agree on many of the things about this particular issue, but, you know, I just went up to him and gave him a hug. Because what else do you do? And that was about it.
Thank you. I want to be sensitive of the time. I know that we are close to, yes? Okay, good. So there was a question about training and programs that might be available. And I think you alluded to resources and that the slide deck would be available to us. And are there formal trainings that Project Shema is offering?
Yeah, so all we do is training. That's literally it. When I told you we've done 107 sessions, by the way, I was doing the count today, and I thought it was really interesting. From October 7th to today, 10/7, 107, we've done 107 educational sessions since October 7th. I just thought that was a little bit something. So literally all we do is workshops and training programs. We run training programs for Jewish leaders and folks who I would define as Jewish adjacent, friends of the tribe, if you will, that are designed to help you build the skills that we talk about here tonight. And we do anti-Semitism education for mixed and non-Jewish audiences. So people bring us in, as an example, to train lay leaders through a synagogue who are part of a social justice club at the synagogue, or something like that. Or we've been brought in to train elected officials at the state level. One of the most random / interesting things we did this year was we trained what amounts to the state legislature progressive caucus in Ontario, Canada, which is known as the provincial members of parliament for the New Democrat Party in Ontario, Canada. Don't ask me how that all came about, but it was interesting. They're MPPs is what they call themselves. And so what we do is try to offer programs to help people who want to engage this conversation, Jewish or otherwise, build the skill set and understanding that they need. And a lot of it expands on what we did here today, which is just sort of like a high-level diagnosis. So as an example, you may not feel comfortable with how you want to tell the story of the Jewish people. We work with you on thinking about how to communicate that. We help you build skills around how to respond to the really tough questions that come up so that you have the equipment, because most of us won't get into the conversation because we're worried about, well, what do I say if I don't know the answer to that, I don't know this history. My favorite one is when people say, like, I don't know enough about the issue, to which I say, how much do you think anybody who's talking about this knows about the issue? Since October 7th, what we found out is there's something like 7 billion international security and Middle East conflict experts in the world, right? Like, we know as much as they do, so we need to engage, and that's what we do, is we offer training programs. You're gonna get all of our information, and if we can be supportive of you, your corporation, we've started doing some stuff for K-12 administrators. If you've got students on college campuses, we'll work with them, we'll work with the administration there. Some of you are familiar with CUNY, like the City University of New York structure. We just did a training for the 25 heads of the 25 CUNY institutions. We're in conversation with Harvard. You may have heard that there's some challenges at Harvard. We're even going to Australia. I'm not going to Australia, but our team is going to Australia next month to meet with Jewish students in Australia before they start their upcoming academic year. So we offer a lot of programs for different levels and different groups.
Thank you so much for this evening and for all the work that you're doing. It is amazing work, and I hope that you're able to put yourself out of business. And I want to thank all of you. I certainly want to thank Hollis, thank you, and all the people with Jackpack. A special thanks again to Nancy Eisenberg, to Barbara Miller, who I think is watching all of this at the moment, for helping on the Temple Jeremiah side and organizing all of this and making this possible this evening. A thank you to Rabbi Heaps, who has been diligently helping with the streaming and the digital aspect. To Danny Glassman, our executive director, for helping set all this up, and Juan Carlos and his team. Thank you again for being here tonight.